I feel a bit guilty highlighting any of them, but I do need to give a particular nod to the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Kimmitt, who has been a stalwart supporter of Brussels Forum. We're absolutely delighted to welcome him back. And the reason I need to highlight him is because it was his idea to have a session at this Brussels Forum on sovereign wealth funds. And given the star cast we have for this conversation, it certainly was a very welcome suggestion on his part. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator for this session, Gideon Rachman. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction. I was just thinking this morning, as I was preparing to do this session, when was the first time I actually heard the phrase sovereign wealth funds? And I wouldn't guarantee that if you had asked me even a year ago, I could have given you a coherent definition of what a sovereign wealth fund is. It's a sign, I think, of how rapidly this issue has emerged as something that was really in the background a few years ago, although sovereign wealth funds have been around for 30 years or more. They weren't much of a topic of discussion, I think, even a year ago. Now, they're really one of the hottest political and financial issues around. And I think in this panel we can explore why that might be and whether all these concerns and all this hype are actually for real, whether we're addressing some real problem. I think one of the reasons that people are so fascinated by sovereign wealth funds are partly because they become much more visible, but also because they combine in an interesting way both high finance and high politics, and they raise fundamental questions about the shifts in economic and political power around the world. Also, there's just a lot of money involved. Nobody quite knows how much, but the estimates that one see are that there are sovereign wealth funds currently control $2.5 trillion, and that figure could grow really quite remarkably over the next decade. We're fortunate to have a panel from all around the world today to talk about these issues. And I'd like to turn first to Robert Kimmitt, the Deputy US Treasury Secretary. I mentioned that this is a subject that now is causing a lot of political controversy and some anxiety. Are people right to be a little bit concerned about these things, do you think?
I think that we don't need to be concerned, but we do need to be informed and vigilant. On the information side, I think we start where Europe has started, and that is that the free flow of capital across borders based on open investment policies is one of the essential elements of a successful global economy. And that the fundamental fact is foreign direct investment produces jobs, produces economic growth, both in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. In the U.S., for example, 1 in 10 private sector jobs is dependent on foreign capital. Every additional $10 million of foreign capital that we obtain creates 30 direct, 30 indirect jobs. And I think we in finance ministries need to tell that positive story about foreign direct investment. On the other side, sovereign wealth funds have been around for 50 years. They have, to this point, been a very positive force in the world economy. Patient long-term investors, not highly leveraged. They do not shift their assets around quickly in times of stress. But as you said, Gideon, they are now growing to both a size and number that I think vigilance is required. Vigilance to ensure they continue to be the positive force in the global macroeconomy that they have been, but vigilant also to make sure that those concerns that I think people could rightly have do not lead to investment protectionism. And that's why we, all of us here on the panel, are engaged in a multilateral effort on both sides of the investment equation. We in the investment recipient countries are working with the OECD to ensure that we're transparent, that we're non-discriminatory, that we're quite clear that this investment is welcome and will be reviewed on a fair and open basis. And on the other side, the IMF and the World Bank are working with the sovereign wealth funds to come up with a voluntary set of best practices that will allow them to demonstrate that they continue to invest for commercial and not political reasons.
Yeah, you used the word vigilant, and you said that vigilance could be justified. Is that essentially what one needs to be vigilant about, the possibility that these investments could be used politically? And what would that even mean? How would China use a stake in a Wall Street investment bank in a political fashion?
I think that is the key point that the sovereign wealth funds need to demonstrate, that the 50-year track record of investing for commercial rather than political reasons will continue into the future. And I think you do that two ways. Number one, that we come to an agreed set of best practices. And on transparency, that would be around the purpose of the fund, the institutional structure and investment strategy, and lastly, the financial figures of the fund. On the first two, there's been great agreement. With regard to the financial figures, that is, the assets held, there has been some continuing discussion on that. Our view is that people should not have to disclose proprietary information or positions, but rather they need to put sufficient information into the public space to demonstrate that they will continue to invest for commercial and not political reasons.
Okay. Perhaps I could turn now to Sheikh Lubna Al-Qasimi. You're the foreign trade minister at the United Arab Emirates. Therefore, you're sitting in one of the countries that people are worrying about, in a sense, but also they're looking at because they've got a huge sovereign wealth fund, particularly in Abu Dhabi. Transparency is one of the issues that people have raised, and I suppose quite a vivid demonstration of that is that people are constantly speculating how much money is there in the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority's coffers. Given that we don't even know a fact as basic as that, aren't people right to worry a little bit about transparency in sovereign wealth funds?
Well, first of all, let's distinguish the old funds that started 40 or 50 years ago. If you look at the Abu Dhabi fund as well as Kuwait, for example, they've been there for years. The idea or the concept behind the sovereign wealth funds is the fact that oil-producing countries create wealth. Oil itself cannot generate jobs, but the wealth generated by the oil revenue itself means that it can fuel the growth of the economy itself, it can help the region, it can also secure future generation employment and a future. So when you look at these funds, they are funds that have been created for economic reason. And they've demonstrated in the last 40, 50 years a good performance as a track record in being a responsible fund. They have not been involved politically. They've actually, in many times, believe it or not, they actually had saved the markets because they are long-term. They look at crises. They stay within these crises to help salvage markets and bail out, but they don't run away. So they've always been responsible in terms of that of their responsibility. What we're seeing today is basically an understanding between recipients and the funds themselves, but in many ways driven by concepts and understanding by the media. We are seeing more cooperation cross-Atlantic in joint committees and meetings amongst the funds themselves as well as the recipients to create a dialogue, but also clarity of what's expected from the sovereign funds themselves. But interestingly, as you look at this, there's also another side. Clarity of the recipient in terms of where the funds should be invested. In other words, today there are requirements of interest. At the end of the day, these funds want to create economic growth, but also a revenue for themselves. But the clarity of the recipient themselves, of what they declare or define as national interest, should also be a responsibility equally to the funds themselves by stating whether a 10% or 20% requirements in terms of injection of these funds as investment, whether there are particular sectors that should be offhand, and going forward, creating an environment where these funds can actually have an opportunity of openness on the other side. So when we talk about clarity, when you talk about transparency, we're talking about joint responsibility. It's not a one-sided story. It just happened that most people keep thinking with the paranoia about these funds and what they are and the size of them. You rightly stated that sovereign funds actually are in an average of $2.5 trillion as of today. Well, that's only 5% of global market finance. So if you compare it to pension funds, if you compare it to insurance funds or others, cumulatively, they are not that large. They are responsible. It is a figure, but it's not a 20%. And it is not, in terms of global market, a fund that actually is large in terms of percentage. It will grow, but even within that, you have growth within the global markets itself.
I saw that earlier in your career you worked for Dubai Ports World, so you've had exposure to protectionist sentiment and concerns about strategic investments. But I was interested, what conclusions did you draw from that whole episode as you're now sitting thinking about sovereign wealth funds?
Yeah. It's quite interesting because I think in the opinion of the United Arab Emirates and Dubai Ports, Dubai World as they are named now, It was a purely business deal that went sour because of political climates, environment at that time in the U.S. For us, we are not the only foreign operating terminal operator coming to the States. There are other terminals operated by foreign entities. But there was a learning lesson on both sides. For us, it was understanding, and as Bob Kimmitt said rightly, understanding the role of these funds or these investments as they go to the States is not to stay within the capital itself, within Washington, D.C. There was a responsibility of ourselves to clarify ourselves in terms of interest in some of the states, for example. I'll give even a better example. There's 6 terminals within Dubai ports, but Doncaster came right after that, and that got involved in 2 different states as well. We need to be in their states. We need to tell people who we are, what we are all about. So there was a learning lesson on our side in terms of communicating, explaining ourselves on one side. On the other side, it created a question, I think, on both sides, both the government and the governments on both sides have been very supportive of each other going through this. But it's the understanding of whether the political implication of an environment can actually impact a deal going through. The question I always talk with Bob Kimmitt about was, even if we put all these regulations and a process in place, when there is a political climate and you have a storm coming up in that aspect, will the deal fall through? Will it go through because you've got impact on politics happening just in time when that deal is taking place? But for us, we've learned to explain ourselves better, to have better presence in the U.S., we found out people actually don't know the United Arab Emirates. People say, what did you learn from Dubai ports? We say, we became famous. At least people know us today. So for us, it's always the the glass half full
just
rather
spell
than
my name right, as they say.
the glass half full rather than the glass half empty. We keep positive that way.
Okay, very good. Joaquín Almunia, you're the Commissioner for Economic and Monetary Affairs, and I know that the Commission has been thinking hard about sovereign wealth funds, is drawing up some voluntary codes of practice and may even advance them at this latest summit. Could you tell us what the latest state of play is in Commission and EU thinking on sovereign wealth funds?
Yes, indeed. Well, a few months ago we started working on a proposal to the European governments, to the European Council that took place yesterday, on how to react from the EU point of view to the new discussions on sovereign wealth funds. As Bob Kimmitt said, these funds were around us for many years, but recently they have been in the front page of newspapers, of the media, of our discussions. Why they have been in the front page during the last months? I think because the Chinese new institution started to invest in some Western companies. This is, I think, the most important factor that has helped to this discussion becoming one of the most important ones. The Commission started working not in a legislative level. We were preparing some principles how to deal from Europe with sovereign wealth funds. And at the same time that we started working, the IMF, the G7, it was a G7 dinner last October in Washington, met finance ministers of the G7 with some multilateral institutions, with some representatives of the most important sovereign wealth funds. And in October, the IMF decided to try to organize discussions with sovereign wealth funds on a code of conduct. And at the same time, the OECD decided to work in trying to coordinate the recipient countries' attitudes towards sovereign wealth funds. So we step up our work, and yesterday the head of state and government discussed our communication and had adopted some clear principles following our proposal. 5 principles. First of all, we should continue to be open to foreign investments. We have been always open, and we have benefited a lot of being an open territory for foreign investment. Second, we should support as European countries, as the European Union, the work both at the IMF level with the sovereign wealth funds and at the OECD level as recipient countries. Third, we need to recall member states that there are some instruments at the national level, in the national legislation, and at the EU level to deal with possible conflicts between the investments coming from sovereign wealth funds and national security interests. Mm-hmm. There are national laws that were adopted in some EU member states. There are some principles that we have to use at the European level not to establish barriers in our internal market when foreign investors come to invest here. And these internal market principles should continue to apply also to these investments. And finally, we should ask the sovereign wealth funds to be transparent, to improve the governance systems, to be accountable, in one word, to assume responsibilities given the importance that these sovereign wealth funds had and the importance that these sovereign wealth funds will have in the future, because these $2.5 or $3 trillion today will continue to grow, and in a few years, some estimates talk about 10 trillion or even more.
Okay. Wouter Bos, obviously there's thinking going on at an EU level, but I know that national governments are also having to grapple with this issue, and that you were in fact asked in your role as Minister of Finance by the Dutch Parliament to report back to them on sovereign wealth funds, their implications and so on. So what were your conclusions? Did you emerge frightened or reassured?
Well, both a little bit. Maybe it's interesting to say a bit first about why we were asked to do this type of survey, because it maybe tells us a little bit about the broader context within which this discussion is being conducted. I guess in the Netherlands there were 3 or 4 reasons for the Parliament to be concerned about the possible role of sovereign wealth funds, and some are specific to the Dutch situation, others are not. First of all, there was this ABN AMRO bank being put up for sale. So that generated a whole discussion in the Netherlands about whether you wanted to have big national icons of your economy to get into foreign hands or not. And it started with a discussion about a bank, but it became a discussion about other institutions in your economy and the extent to which you can hold politicians responsible for trying to prevent foreign players coming into your economy or not, or whether you have an economic benefit in actually maintaining Dutch players in the Dutch economy. A second reason for the discussion was the remarks made by Commissioner Mandelson, who at some point in time, and I know that not everybody necessarily agreed with Commissioner Mandelson at that time, but who started the discussion about golden shares as one of the means to actually maintain national interest within major companies in one's economy. A third specific circumstance is that in the Netherlands we had quite a fierce discussion on the role of hedge funds, private equity funds, shareholder activism, whether there was a tendency towards more short-termism within the capitalist system, if you like. And that kind of fed a lot of concern among politicians, and it fed a broader public debate as well as to whether there was enough control, as to whether politicians were at all able to influence anything in the economy. And on top of all that, suddenly we noted that there were not only sovereign wealth funds that are big and that are growing bigger, but there were also new players on the stage, like the Chinese. And we also saw them investing in sectors where we hadn't seen them before. In the Netherlands, for example, the Chinese came into the picture when Barclays was bidding for ABN AMRO, and the Chinese took a share in Barclays. But also they took a share in Fortis. And those were financial institutions where we hadn't seen them before. And it raised concern as to whether this was an investment like any other investment, or whether we should have any specific concern. And what we felt happening in discussions with our Parliament was that there was a lot of emotion in this discussion. There was a lot of not so rational fear and concern that had to, that in a way is all. You can bring it all back in a way to the fact that in a world full of uncertainty and quickly changing economic circumstances, people want something to hold on to. They want something to be sure of. And here, a lot of things that they thought they were sure of were changing. And things that they thought they were national suddenly were no longer. And in order to try to cool that discussion down and try to get the facts back on the table, we conducted a survey on sovereign wealth funds, and we looked at strategic sectors in our economy and as to whether they were vulnerable for investments by strategic wealth funds and whether there was a need for additional instruments to address the possible threat of sovereign wealth funds. And the number one conclusion was, as was being said here, that if you look at how sovereign wealth funds have conducted in the past, they were absolutely ideal investors because they've always taken minority interests. They never looked for active influence, power within the company. And they're long-term investors with a long-term horizon, which was, exactly the type of investment behavior that you're looking for in discussions about shareholder activism and increasing short-termism. And on the other hand, there was still all the speculation about what may happen if, and what would happen if the Chinese would do this or if the Chinese would do that. One of the conclusions I drew of that argument was that if you're totally honest, I guess most of the discussion is not about sovereign wealth funds, but it's much more specific about the Chinese, because they are the new kids on the block. There is the greatest lack of transparency, and there possibly is also the greatest concern as to whether they play with the rules that we are all used to. And as long as that degree of honesty lacks in the discussion, it's a bit difficult to actually get to the point and try to find out what we're really concerned about and what we should do.
Well, listening to you talk about what model investors they've been in the past, I suddenly remembered the little statement that always comes on the bottom of any investment you take out in Britain, which is past performance is no guide to the future. So,
you have the same one.
And I think it does have some relevance because we've seen perhaps even with our equivalents of sovereign wealth funds here in the West, with pension funds, they can be purely economic investors for a long time, and then they get put under political pressure, and suddenly actually they do start making political demands. And can we be sure that even if sovereign wealth funds, invest largely for economic reasons, behave for a very long time in a purely sort of capitalistic economic fashion, that we're not in the very least, at least putting them in the position whereby in some future date they could exert political pressure?
No, we cannot be sure. I guess there are no guarantees here to be given, but there are some very generic instruments, generic policies that one can use to reduce the risk. For example, if you've got adequate legislation on competition, you can always make sure that if foreign entities or national entities take over companies in your economy, that they can never arrive at a dominant position in the market. So you can never become too dependent on them. That's a matter of competition legislation. We've got some legislation coming up now that actually asks shareholders to much earlier reveal who they are and what their strategic intentions are. That's another more generic way to address the issue, which is not specific to sovereign wealth funds, but does help to address some of the risks that come with sovereign wealth funds.
Okay, well, we've got a large and well-informed audience. I'd now like to turn to all of you and solicit some questions. Could I ask people to identify who you are, and then perhaps whether you're directing the question to anyone in particular? The gentleman in the front row here. I think a microphone will be coming to you. As you like. Just you don't have to stand up, but just say who you are.
Okay. I'm Takotsuka from Japan. I'm quite optimistic about the role of the sovereign wealth fund because some of the discussants pointed out the sovereign wealth fund is long-term and purely economic motivated investors. So I think it's quite good counterbalance against the short-term investors like the hedge funds or the private equity activists. And in fact, in Japan, recently, sovereign wealth funds, some of sovereign wealth funds start buying Japanese stocks, which are pretty underperformed, while there are many opportunities like the financial sector, which is subprime loan problem-free, or the environmental sectors, and solar power, water desalination. But Western, not only Western, but the short-term investors are still selling Japanese stocks to mainly, I think, they realize their profits to counter that. So I'm quite optimistic about this. But the problem is, as Mr. from the UAE pointed out, the transparency on both sides, investors and the recipients. So my question for the discussant is what can we do in the recipient side to be transparent?
Okay. I'll just perhaps take another couple of questions and then let you all have a bite of them. There's the gentleman just behind you there.
My name is János Martonja. I'm a professor for international trade law, and I have to express my gratitude to the sovereign wealth funds because they call the attention to a phenomenon or to a challenge which is substantially wider than the investment decisions or investments made by sovereign wealth funds, which I find myself have been extremely beneficial to the world in the last 40 or 50 years. But I'm convinced that the challenge has become now much, much wider, and we should give as much attention to, for instance, state-owned companies or semi-state-owned companies or even private companies which are acting under political influence or instructions. And we all know that the political hand now is there. I also know it from practice. I know about big companies who are not interested at all in the outcome of financial or even legal due diligence. The only thing what they are interested in are basically geopolitical or political considerations. And in Central Europe, we have, of course, a very peculiar sensitivity to this phenomenon. And that is why we think that this whole problem should be given a much wider approach. And these other actors or players should also be covered by any future code of conduct or legislation or whatever.
Okay.
For the instruments.
Sorry, but just to give them a chance to respond, do you mind if I sort of
The question
summarize
is very simple. I mean,
sure,
don't we think that these other actors or possible investors should be covered? Don't we think that the idea of reciprocity or effective reciprocity, as it was developed decades before, should also be applied in this regard? Don't we think that the so-called generic approach, competition law and capital market legislation, is sufficient? Don't we think that the national
that's three, don't you think?
Sufficient or not?
I think let's give them a chance to think. Yeah, Mr. Kimmitt.
Why don't I take the second one, and then maybe one of my colleagues can take it first from our Japanese colleague. First, I think it is important to point out that state-owned assets can take various forms: official reserves, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, or state-owned enterprises. And the debate has tended to focus on sovereign wealth funds only, but there are issues raised by other of those investors, and I think you're correct to point out particularly state-owned enterprises where the state has made a conscious decision to keep that industry under state control. And when a state-owned enterprise particularly looks to invest abroad, particularly if it is looking to invest in a sector that is not open in the home country, that does raise a set of issues. Now, we in the U.S. in our investment review legislation, and I might note also in other legislation, competition, banking, securities, do look at the nationality of the potential acquirer. We are required under the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. to do a more detailed inquiry whether the investor is a state-owned enterprise or a sovereign wealth fund. But again, we do it against the backdrop of an open investment policy. We tried to get to a yes answer unless, in our case, there's a security concern that cannot be properly addressed, or I would imagine in the case of competition, securities, or banking regulators, some regulatory or anti-competitive issue that cannot be resolved. On reciprocity, it's a very good point. We happen to believe that inbound investment is so beneficial to the U.S., we have not listed reciprocity as a gating factor, not a criterion that we apply, particularly in our security review. But, as Sheikha Lubna said, all cross-border investment takes place in a broader political environment where reciprocity is a very important factor. And as investors look at talking to people at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, that is in the administration and in the Congress, they will find that that reciprocity factor will come up, and particularly, again, for a state-owned enterprise coming from a sector that might not be open to American, European, and other investors at home.
Yeah. I can see all of you want to come in on this, but Mr. Boss, I mean, I think one of Mr. Almunia's colleagues, Charlie McCreevy, put it quite well when he said, you know, is there really a distinction between Gazprom and a sovereign wealth fund when we're thinking about investments? Is there? Sorry.
No, no. I guess there isn't. It just makes the discussion even more complicated.
Yeah.
That's why I'd like to leave it out of the picture. But I guess that, looking at the core of the questions, there's not a real difference here. Could I just make a quick comment on two issues? One on reciprocity. I believe that's a political issue much more than economic issue, because economically, if it's good for my economy that the Chinese invest, it doesn't matter whether I'm allowed to invest in China. I mean, if it's good for my economy, they're welcome. So reciprocity is a way through which you can actually force other governments to open their borders, because if you don't this to me, then I won't do that to you. But in terms of what's beneficial to my economy, it doesn't add any value. The other thing is, you mentioned, Ron, you mentioned nationality, checking, screening on the nationality of investors. It is one of the things we have looked at in that study that I mentioned, and it is one of the things where we ended up saying that we really can't see how you can make a justified distinction between investors from one country and investors from another country.
And yet
you can make a distinction between good investors' behavior and bad investors' behavior. You can make a distinction between commercial behavior and non-commercial behavior.
But then aren't you evading the political issue then?
Justify why a French state company is good and a Chinese sovereign wealth fund is bad.
Sure.
That's difficult.
Yeah, correct.
I'm sorry. I was answering in the context of the question about state-owned enterprises. It was really national ownership that I was talking about, not the individual nationality. It was really whether it was a state-owned or controlled enterprise, which is the criterion. So I was not clear on that because I was trying to go to the specific question.
Sorry, the point I was trying to make is, isn't there a slight sort of discrepancy between you saying, well, to be honest, actually when people worry about sovereign wealth funds, they're worrying about the Chinese, and then saying, well, but this isn't an issue we can address. I mean, as a politician, don't you have to address that?
Well, I mean, politics is full of inconsistencies, and this is probably one of them.
Fair enough.
I mean, this is the difference about a discussion in newspapers, in political fora, in constituencies, which is full of inconsistencies and emotions, and then there's the other world of business and economics and rational analysis, and what you can do and what you cannot do, and it's very hard to bring the two together. I mean, and in a way that's my job to try to do that, and it doesn't always work that successfully, I admit.
Okay, Sheikha Lubna, I saw you wanted to say something.
On terms of reciprocity, let's explain sometimes situations of countries. For example, there are countries that actually are blessed and benefited by the oil itself. But at the same time, you may not have other instruments of reciprocity, except for opening up markets for major tender by these countries who you'd like to invest in their country, but in return, you've opened up your markets for major contribution of their company. So reciprocity may not be exactly in one-to-one, but it's the whole rather than the particular sector. So in that, it actually combines both comments from both of you when you open up. There is one instrument that's actually quite well known, which is the BIT, the Bilateral Investment Treaty. If you look at countries who have signed up, pretty much most of the time, whether it's private sector or government investment, it goes through a dialogue of this particular treaty. Otherwise, it becomes then a chapter as part of a free trade agreement. So you are containing a boundary and a definition within the investment treaty itself, whether it's an FTA format or whether it's an independent bilateral investment treaty. But I want to make one comment. We keep everybody, and you keep talking about emotional on this part. When the Asian markets was brought down, it was not a sovereign fund, if you remember. It was a hedge fund. And to me, at the end of the day, whether there's jitters in the market, whether there is concern in the market, then the concern should be about any fund, regardless whether it's owned by a government or a state or none. You have to, the measure has to be out there where you can actually see there are impacts or not. But generally speaking, today, all the markets, financial global markets, are actually interdependent. If you look at, for example, the Citigroup investment that came from ADIA, it may look to a lot of people that it's just opportunity. But on the other side of it, what people sometimes may not see, that this bank is an international global bank that actually the sustainability of this bank and its health in terms of existence impacts everybody worldwide. It doesn't impact the Americans by themselves. It really is a bank where everybody deals with them, whether they're a client or an owner. So the interdependence in the market means when there's a fund out there helping or bailing out or investing as an opportunity, it is not just about an opportunity. We are all actually are impacted by global markets today. So we can't afford to have a fallout somewhere.
Mr. Almunia?
Just two brief comments. First of all, about reciprocity. We didn't use this as a principle in our contribution to the discussion, and yesterday the conclusions of the European Council didn't mention the word reciprocity. Because I think it was Bob who said, if this investment, or Wouter, if these investments are good, are welcome, are positive for us, we don't need reciprocity as an automatic trigger for authorizing this investment. I am concerned by my own interest, by my own needs of capital. I will establish some kind of principle regarding transparency, investment criteria. I want to know why they want to invest here, if it is because of economic arguments or because some other arguments. But I will not ask automatically reciprocity. So we prefer not to use this as a principle. Another thing is at the political level, in the general considerations. The sovereign wealth funds and state-owned enterprises, we should be extremely careful in identifying the treatment. In some cases, we can find the same kind of problems when dealing with a sovereign wealth fund that wants to invest in a strategic sector in one of our countries, and we don't know why, what kind of governance system, what kind of economic criteria, and we need to think in our national security reasons, or state-owned enterprise in the energy sector that can create problems, and the same kind of considerations will appear. But in many other cases, we are talking about different institutions, different problems, different challenges, so we prefer not to identify state-owned enterprises with sovereign wealth funds. And now we should concentrate, I think, our attention in this discussion during the coming months in reaching good agreements at the IMF level for the Code of Conduct of Sovereign Wealth Funds, at the OECD for the recipient countries. Both sides needs to increase transparency and to increase clarity in how to deal with these investment flows.
Thanks. Right. There's a woman at the back, just in front of you. There's a microphone just next to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Wendy Sherman. I'm a principal of both the Albright Group and Albright Capital Management, and I should say our strategic investor is PGGM, a Dutch public pension fund. I think there are a number of things going on here. I have a comment and then a question. There is political anxiety, and the United States saw this back in the 70s when Mitsubishi wanted to buy Rockefeller Center. And you would have thought that the world was coming to an end as we knew it. In fact, they did buy Rockefeller Center, I think lost money on the deal, unfortunately, and nobody thinks twice about it today. Because some of this is just a political anxiety that comes from change and from development. And I quite agree with Minister Bas that part of this is anxiety about what China is going to do as this sovereign wealth fund grows so quickly, so large. Secondly, I think there's economic anxiety as the world economic markets are having problems, and certainly the American economic system is in trouble. And on one hand, you don't see any American politicians saying to Abu Dhabi, you're not seeing anybody from Citigroup say, take your money back because we need it. But there is economic anxiety. And then thirdly, I think there is both anxiety and a sense that there needs to be transparency and responsibility here. And that responsibility is not only around strategic assets, but also about responsible investing, which is the other side of this dimension, which is in what ways do we expect capital flows to do things to affect policy as opposed to stay out of policy. So there's a big push among pension funds in particular for responsible investing. So that is also policy driven and not simply commercial. though I would argue that sustainability has commercial value in the end. So this is a very complex problem where we, I think, can't single out any one driver. My question to you all actually connects the last session on climate change with this one, which is, I think, as these sovereign wealth funds and other vehicles grow, there will be pressure, as I think in the case of China, for that money to be spent to solve the climate dimension for China. That it not be the United States that finances, or the developed world that finances the developing world's issues, but that the sovereign wealth get used for that or for issues of poverty. And so my question to you is, what is the flip side from your perspective? What do you think sovereign wealth funds should be doing? What responsibility do they have for their in-country issues?
Okay. I'll take a couple more. Dan Dresner here has written a couple of papers on sovereign wealth funds. So,
Thanks. In some ways, sovereign wealth funds are more of a symptom rather than a cause. I mean, part of the reason you're seeing such the rapid growth and why the growth is projected to be so large is because of the macroeconomic imbalances in the global system, which is China is racking up such massive amounts of dollar reserves that they have to invest in sovereign wealth funds because they've already invested $1 trillion in bank assets. So I guess my question to the panel, specifically I guess Mr. Kimmitt, is to what extent will the deeper macroeconomic imbalance problem be addressed? I mean, part of dealing with sovereign wealth funds is, I agree with everything that's said, they've mostly invested quite prudently. But unless the deeper problem is solved, this is not going to go away and the anxiety is only going to increase.
I think I'll stop there for the moment. Mr. Kimmitt, you asked an interesting direct question. Isn't this really about macro imbalances in the end?
Certainly, they are closely related, and we've said that as sovereign wealth funds move forward, as we look to the future, and them continuing to play a responsible and important role in the world economy, that they too, as countries more than funds, have a responsibility to continue to address global imbalances. We in the U.S. need to increase our savings rate. We need to continue to see demand-led growth, especially in Europe and Asia. And the Chinese need to appreciate their currency more quickly. We have seen some acceleration in the appreciation of the Chinese yuan recently. That's welcome. We happen to think that they need to move more quickly to valuing their currency based on underlying market fundamentals. That is, I might say, part of our broader strategic economic dialogue with the Chinese, which, as I think Wendy knows, is also going to the issue of environmental, including what is the appropriate role for the Chinese to play in addressing some of their environmental problems and joining with us and others in addressing regional and global environmental problems. And I think that I'm not sure it's as much a sovereign wealth fund issue as it is for the owners of the sovereign wealth funds, that is the governments, how to use state resources appropriately. We have an idea out right now, for example, for a clean technology fund to try to get governments to help invest on clean technologies as part of that approaching post-Kyoto framework. I might say that some of the sovereign wealth funds, including the Chinese, do have some inward investment responsibilities. We look at those. I would say that we're looking more closely right now in the multilateral sense at some of their cross-border activities. But aren't we creating, we hope, in the sovereign wealth funds and in their owners, the countries, people who, because of that cross-border investment, have a deeper stake in a successful world economy running on the basis of those principles of free trade, flexible exchange rates, free flow of capital across borders, who have a common commitment to address those structural imbalances precisely because the higher returns that they seek will not come unless we do this on a well-coordinated basis.
Sheikha Lubna, on this question of internal responsibilities, is that something you have to think about? How do you balance investing overseas and development back home?
The funds themselves and other instruments actually had been quite good in terms of building the place. If you look at the United Arab Emirates today, 65% of its GDP is actually in the non-oil sector, regardless of being one of the top 5 worldwide, whether it's in oil production, gas, or reserve. But on the other side, I also would like to make a statement about the founder of the country, Sheikh Zayed. Sheikh Zayed actually abounded and stopped flaring of a lot of the oil rigs at that time, basically for protection of environment. So it's not new. This is from the 70s that's something that had taken place. But recently, too, the government of Abu Dhabi had created a company called Masdar. And Masdar is a renewable energy initiative with over 10 or $20 billion worth of investment with research on clean technology related to energy and other things. So regardless whether it's if you want to use the sovereign fund acceptance in other countries for being someone who's committed and responsible for environment, I think maybe that's the direction Wendy was asking. But for the United Arab Emirates has always been responsible toward the environment even earlier.
Mr. Almunia, you looked interested in this question of macro imbalances and sovereign wealth funds.
Just to underline that I fully agree that the origin of the imbalances should be tackled. We are today discussing the growing importance of sovereign wealth funds, and it's a very important discussion, but the accumulation of imbalances in the surpluses of China or the Asian emerging economies, oil producers, other commodity producers, and the increase of imbalances in the deficit countries, US and others, cannot continue. This is the origin of other problems that we are having now, much more serious than the sovereign wealth funds discussion, that is the financial turmoil and its consequences. So we need to tackle this. And we need to tackle, and I fully agree with Bob Kimmitt, in a cooperative way. In the case of China and other emerging economies, they should increase internal consumption. And the appreciation of the exchange rate is one of the elements of this strategy, but it's not the only one. And the kind of challenges that they should tackle, that they should deal with in the coming years because of the pattern of growth that they are having today is huge. So they will need to pay much more attention to their internal challenges than not only to manage the sovereign wealth funds, the new Chinese sovereign wealth fund, to $100 billion, with two-thirds of these $200 billion oriented towards the internal necessities of China. Only one-third of the Chinese sovereign wealth fund is oriented to the outside world. But this is only a part of the solution. The Chinese should rebalance a lot the growth pattern. The cooperation between consumers and producers of other commodities is a very big challenge for all of us in the coming years, because if not, we will suffer not only growth consequences of the financial turmoil, but at the same time, inflation consequences of the tensions in the commodity markets, and this is creating a difficult situation for all of us.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think at this point I should offer a collective apology to all of you, because we've only got about 20 minutes left, and I'm not going to be able to take all the interventions, but I'll sort of do it at random. Somebody who had their hand up earlier, I think she's gone, so she's missed her opportunity. Jean-Pierre Lehmann.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre Lehmann, Avion Group at IMD. I just want to make a slight correction that it was not in the 1970s that Mitsubishi bought Rockefeller Center, but in the 1980s, after the Plaza Accord, which resulted in the stiff appreciation of the yen, which went from 250 to 120. And I think one can predict that the same thing is going to happen with the Chinese when you're pressuring for the appreciation of the renminbi. And my guess would be that at the Brussels summit next year or the year after, we'll be talking about the Chinese buying up the United States because of misguided U.S. pressure on seeking to increase the rate of that currency, as you did with Japan 23 years ago.
Okay, thank you for that.
Gideon, can
yeah, Mr. Kimmitt, you want to respond to that?
Let me just come in on this. First of all, on the misguided U.S. pressure, first of all, we, Europe, indeed the G7 more broadly, have taken a common position that China needs to appreciate its currency more quickly toward underlying market valuation. And oh, by the way, that is also the Chinese position. Word for word, we differ on the pace, but not the goal or direction. Secondly, with regard to Chinese investment, including the recent Chinese investment by their sovereign wealth fund, look at how carefully they have structured the deals, particularly into the U.S. financial sector, to be decidedly minority participants, keep it under 9.9%, very frequently under 4.9%, which are regulatory triggers for other authorities, no board seats, standstill agreements not to grow any further. What the Chinese have essentially said to us is, listen, we have to diversify this portfolio. It has to have an equity component. We want our international equity component to include the U.S. Please tell us the right way to invest in the United States. And that's why I think it is very important for us, as Sheikha Lubna said, to make sure that we're as transparent on the investment recipient side as we expect the sovereign wealth funds to be.
Mr. Kimmitt, I mean, in all of these discussions, the word strategic is chucked around a lot, and people say, well, some kind of investments are okay, but strategic sectors of the economy, perhaps we need to be more careful about. Is that a valid distinction? And is, for example, a Wall Street investment bank a strategic asset? I mean, arguably, given how they're doing at the moment, the strategic threats to China if they buy them. But how do you think about this issue of strategic?
We have not used the strategic sector approach that has been used by other countries. In our investment review law, the new one, the Foreign Investment National Security Act that was passed last summer, there is guidance provided as to some sectors, infrastructure, oil, defense industrial base, that require a special look. But we've had plenty of investments into those sectors. As I said, it's just for state-owned and controlled companies that there is a higher degree of investment scrutiny, again, within the context of the open investment policy statement. So we have chosen not to do it on a sectoral, strategic basis, believing that if we look at these on a case-by-case basis, trying to strike that balance between promoting open investment and protecting national security, that in most cases we can come to an approval for the investment. And one other point, if I might just make, I think in the wake of Dubai Ports World 2, where there were lessons learned both by the investor and by the investment review authorities, the impression I think was given that we review every cross-border investment and we blocked many of them. In fact, in calendar year 2007, there were 11,000 M&A activities in the United States, 2,000 of which were cross-border, a foreign entity buying a U.S. asset, of which only 143 came before the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., none of which was blocked. And I don't think there's ever been a circumstance, even in the 70s when it was created, it was actually Saudi petrodollars buying up U.S. farmland that led to the creation of CFIUS. It was the Japanese in the 80s. There's never been a year that I'm aware of that more than 10% of the cross-border deals have even come before the committee. And in the entire 20-year statutory history of the committee, only one investment has been blocked by the President.
Mr. Boss?
Yeah, we did look at strategic sectors and whether policy-wise there's anything you can do to protect strategic sectors from certain investments, including, if that's what you would want to do, investments from sovereign wealth funds. And maybe two conclusions are interesting here. First is that where economists and policymakers tend to look at strategic sectors, the political debate is very much about strategic companies. It's not about the financial sector, but it's about a bank. It's not about the system of infrastructure, but it's about whether you want to put shares of your airport company on the market. And that is a lot more complicated and policy-wise a lot more difficult to handle. Second issue is that within Europe, if one were to agree that there is a need to protect strategic sectors against certain types of investment behavior, it can actually only be done at a European level, because the European Treaty hardly gives any room to do that at a national level. But then one has to agree at a European level what strategic sectors are. And here the difficulties start, because I am told the French regard their national yogurt champion Danone as a strategic company, whereas we tend to look at other sectors and other companies.
I think they deny that. I think
they
thought about the strategic yogurt, but in the end not. I know both of you want to come in. Sheikha Lubna.
Well, since everyone is demanding sovereign funds to have a consistent and a common code of conduct, transparency, Don't we all need to understand whether it's a strategic sector or a national interest or national security? There are 3 words and 3 definitions being used amongst the recipient countries. And the definition themselves keep changing within the content. I mean, would you consider Liverpool football team as a strategic sector, a national interest, or a national security? So when you deny access to
all 3, yeah.
So my question here is, that definition keeps changing as well. I think Bob Kimmitt said something about, you talked about strategic sector. You talked about national security. Some others call it national interest. Sure. So that in itself, what would you define? What would fall under that? Is that everything? Are you concerned about patentship? Is it more about defense? Is it more about technology patentship? If they are defined clearly, I think sovereign funds would actually appreciate that equally. And that's what we're talking about, joint responsibility of understanding both sides. Okay. But I thought maybe the football team was more nationalistic than the yogurts in France.
So it's a Liverpool thing. Nobody else cares.
Was denied.
Well, the treaty of the European Union does not solve this very difficult question on Liverpool or Manchester United. It will depend who will give the opinion.
Manchester lost recently.
For me, it's my team, the Spanish team. The strategic question. But the treaty talks about the possibility of establishing exceptions to the free movement of capital when there is a real and serious threat to national security. This is the concept that is in the treaty. And so far, is the European Court of Justice who had interpreted through their rulings when this national interest has a real threat. So far, we have not competence at the European level to establish a general rule. These are national legislations that are interpreted because of the free movement of capital recognized in the European Treaty by the Court. When the new Treaty of Lisbon will come into force, we can. There is a new competence in the new treaty, so hopefully next year, at the European level, we can establish this more precise definition from the European law point of view of what we can interpret as a national interest.
Okay, I think a couple more questions. The gentleman here, just.
Thank you. A few years ago, Ken Rogoff wrote an interesting article in the Post, the Washington Post, titled "A Debtor's Empire." And in it, he basically looked at America's growing debts, of course, which have gotten worse since. And what we've seen in the evolution of sovereign wealth funds is a manifestation, in my view, of a major shift in political power. And what we've heard in a lot of the comments today is, oh, don't worry about it if they just buy 4.9% or 9.9%, or, oh, the Japanese overbought after the Plaza Accord, nothing to worry about. And I'm interested in the absence of discussion about whether or not this massive shift in assets in the world today, I'm not hearing this sort of concomitant discussion about the massive shift in political power and what that means in terms of, the tectonics of geopolitical realities, and whether or not we're just engaged in telling ourselves it will really all be okay, there's nothing to worry about, or whether in fact there are fundamental power shifts going on. And Sheikha Lubna, I want to ask you one side element about the Citibank decision. And investment is with the subprime loan crisis, while you've got a glut of global capital out there, lots of other pools of capital were not financing some of the institutions engaged in the subprime loan process because they didn't know how much more bad debt was there. And the very activity and the entry of the sovereign wealth funds into that market when other pools of capital were not is perhaps the first time we've seen sovereign wealth funds behave differently than other pools of capital. Not in an inappropriate way, in a way that may have helped, but nonetheless, I think it's hard to argue that sovereign wealth funds were moving into cases like Citibank out of commercial decisions as opposed to political ones.
Okay, I'll take one more. Gentleman just there, second row. Could you say who you are as well?
Mark Leyland. I chaired the German Marshall Fund. Sorry. As Bob knows, I chaired CFIUS in the ancient days, and we had the Kuwaiti Santa Fe case was our first one, and the issue was, what's interesting, I'm interested that everybody has really decided reciprocity, and because Bob is perfectly correct. Reciprocity as an issue in the Treasury Department is a nothing. As the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, it's not nothing. I mean, the question is, you can say the same argument for free trade. I mean, free trade is a benefit to all the free traders, and we all remember Niskanen, who said we shouldn't have any negotiations, we should just open our market entirely because it's a benefit to us. Is this not, my first question is, in a sense, isn't this an issue that the European Union and the U.S., in a sense, could agree that maybe it is an issue? It may even be helping the other countries that are trying to invest at a time, because they would just as soon open up some of their markets, but voluntarily saying we're not going to, since it's such a benefit to us, there's no question it's a benefit to us, but would it be more of a benefit to us, and I can ask that to the minister, if they also opened their markets? It's not a question of that this isn't a benefit, but is there some way that you would use that leverage? My second in asking Bob on this is, it sounds to me that there are two issues going on here, and I think in their summation of it, one is the minority interest. When I was at the Treasury, the Commerce Department put out the biggest investor in the United States by far. I think now it's Britain, it was then Holland, the Dutch. And of course, I never could understand that, except it obviously was the Netherlands Antilles and it was the Middle East. Having no transparency was actually better. They couldn't influence anything. All they did is they came through the Dutch, through their own separate companies, and nobody knew who they were. But they didn't exert any influence, and they didn't buy that much of it. But the Dutch were our biggest investors. After them was the British. So that my next, in a sense, that's just an anecdote. Is there some issue that's not strategic? I mean, you touch on it, and we don't have that power in CFIUS. George Shultz and I were the only two that wanted to look at what happened when the French nationalizations took over businesses that were in the U.S. owned by French companies. Because Mitterrand's avowed purpose was employment in France. He did not have a capitalistic idea of, he would move a factory to France to get the employment rather than where, and that's something, I think a lot of these issues, and I think are going to be issues that if the administrations don't take it, Congress will do a Sarbanes-Oxley type thing on them. There will be enough emotional about it. My final point really is on the issue of what we're at. It is true historically, for instance, we all knew when the Japanese were going to take over the world, and they had all these assets. It may be the same with the Chinese, that they will have their own internal problems and things will somewhat. That is a macro problem. But I guess my two questions really have to do with reciprocity, and are you making a distinction, because I think there is, between owning 29%, 20%. Do you want to have the same rule for them that you have for somebody who's in a takeover, that if they buy 29%, they have to buy the whole thing? Okay. Or would you prefer not? That's the question.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so if you could answer those questions and say any concluding thoughts, I guess now's the time. Sheikha Lubna.
In terms of investment, I think it would be very hard to, and I think we've heard this over and over, to define reciprocity a fact for fact, because the competence of each country is different. Someone may have a flow of wealth that can be invested abroad, but there are other things that need technology, know-how, major investments in different sectors. So it's not, there's not a definitive answer to say how you could actually define reciprocity, but under framework of a bilateral investment treaty or free trade agreements, you define pretty much what's actually helpful on both sides. Money might be needed on one side, but sometimes there are knowledge, business operation that's required from the other side. You know, when we talk about markets and talk about Citigroup or others, have you read the newspaper yesterday and today? I would probably go and take, instead of my vitamins, a Prozac. Who's going to salvage markets? Who's out there today who's actually standing by some of these major crises? These investors have been there for a long time. They've been there for 40 years and 50 years. There's a behavior or a definition or concern about a new fund or an emerging fund. We should not mix the cards. We should know who actually had been there, who'd been loyal to the market. And honestly speaking, the funds that have existed for a long time, so where you talk about the Kuwaitis or the Abu Dhabi fund, at the end of the day, they are responsible. They worked through this for the longest time. They have a good track record. If they didn't, they wouldn't be surviving till today. And as I said earlier, it really is about a joint transatlantic responsibility for all of us. When a market falls in Asia, we all get hurt, even in the U.S., and vice versa. Okay. So who wants that to happen? None of us.
Mr. Boss?
I agree with a lot of what you said just now. I mean, this discussion is full of paradoxes. One of them is looking back in the past, we see ideal investment behavior, and still we're very worried about a possible future. Another one is, like you exactly said, in a way we always wanted to globalize financial markets. We wanted to develop underdeveloped economic powers. We wanted to reduce borders for free flow of capital. And now that we're successful, we're scared about the consequences. And a third one is, you know, these funds play their role in helping us out of the financial crisis, and rather than be thankful to them, we distrust their intentions. I mean, so that makes the discussion very complicated, and I guess a bit frustrating at times from the investors' point of view. I would just want to say one more thing. I did not understand today's discussion, certainly not when I heard Mr. Kimmitt speak, or even myself, that what we are saying is, look, there's nothing to worry about, let it all just be. I mean, I heard Kimmitt talk about vigilance, and I think that's the right word. You know, there's every reason to continue to be alert, to see what may happen, and to be prepared for those circumstances. At the same time, if you look at very specific policies that one could use, it is extremely difficult to address these risks. I mean, in the latest ECOFIN meeting, when we sat together with European Ministers of Finance, one of our colleagues said, you know, would it be possible to distinguish between commercial behavior and non-commercial behavior of investors, and then take them to court if there's non-commercial behavior? Is that something? But, you know, there are even a lot of commercial companies that have non-commercial behavior. Yeah. So, and what is strategic and what is not is another one that we haven't been able to solve. Or can you distinguish between one nationality and another nationality is one that we haven't been able to solve. So I say there's every reason to be vigilant, but at this point in time what we should do is emphasize that the instruments that we already have in terms of how we legislate on competition and competition authorities, or on shareholder rights and shareholder identity and shareholder intentions, that those instruments give us, for this point in time, enough room to maneuver.
Okay, well, we have, I think, a couple of minutes left, I'm afraid. Mr. Almunia?
No, very, very shortly. I think we should keep in mind that openness of our economies, of our financial markets, is in our own interest. It's not a concession to the others. It's in our own interest. Second, that to maintain this openness without giving up to protectionist trends or to fear reactions, we need to establish some rules, not by regulation, but by self-regulation, by code of conduct, by good practices, by exchanging good best practices among us, among the recipients, establishing clear lines, more transparent attitudes of the recipient countries. And third point, there is a change in the power in the world. Indeed, there is this change. The power is being distributed, not only the economy or the savings or the investments. Power, political power, is being distributed. This is a global world.
Okay. Mr. Kimmitt, last word.
On reciprocity, Mark, again, a very important principle. We just don't think it should be an investment review criterion. It should be in free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, in the new transatlantic economic dialogue, and our strategic economic dialogue with China, that should be discussed, because I think our openness to investment, to trade, is the trump card of economic success now and in the future. Steve, you're exactly right. There has been a tectonic shift in the global financial and economic world as much as the political security world. One of the great things about the Brussels Forum is it looks across both parts of that shift. I would actually say, as we look at addressing the macroeconomic imbalances, we need to think about what the global financial architecture of the future should look like. I think today we reflect much more Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944 than we do the economy of today or the future. So maybe next year, rather than talking about the Chinese buying up the U.S. or elsewhere, we'll have a panel on global financial architecture where Bob Zoellick and Dominique Strauss-Kahn can lay out their reform agenda at those two important institutions. And Joaquín Almunia can talk European View, and the new Deputy Secretary of the Treasury can contribute from the U.S. side.
Well, thank you very much for making us look forward to next year, because I'm uncomfortably aware that there are lots of people I haven't been able to call upon, but this is clearly a topic that's going to be with us for some time. So thank you all, and particularly thanks to the panel. Sure, my pleasure.
Okay, now we're going for lunch. The first year, we had a complaint. People said, we don't get out of the hotel, we don't get into small groups, so we created lunches last year. They were small, they were complicated, and they were really successful. People liked them. So we repeated them this year. There's a few lunches that are going to stay in the building. If you're first, hold up your tag, and there's a number on one side or another. If you have a 1, 2, 3, or 7, when you go out the door, go right. All others go left. It's not a political statement. 1, 2, 3, 7, go right. And then what we'd really like you to do is be back here at 4 o'clock for our next general session. Enjoy lunch. Thank you. And thank all of you. That was great.
Thank you very much.